Welcome to Lean RPA Principles and Practice, Chapter 7, Think Like a Lean Startup by Rob King. In Chapters 1 to 5, we covered the foundations of Lean Six Sigma and automation. We covered topics such as questions about people and types of automation, helping to engage your stakeholders, and some of the frameworks you can put in place to actually help you through your automation journey. In Chapter 6, we delved deeply into Lean thinking and how some of the key skills within Lean apply specifically to RPA. Armed with all of this information, we now step into Chapter 7, which is going to start to look at how we begin to run a pilot. Chapter 7 then will start to look at how we run a pilot and particularly delve into some of the key tools that we're going to use to be able to map our processes, select the processes for automation, and measure the success of our automation program. At the end of this chapter, we'll start to put it all together with the Lean game plan which we visited before and see what are the steps we need to make to move beyond the pilot. Our motto when talking to people who haven't yet to begin on their automation journey is that it's better to start somewhere than not start at all. We also encourage that in getting started that you apply a very collaborative approach, agile, or the lean startup model we looked at an earlier chapter. When first embarking on your automation program, one of the things that we talk about are two distinct phases of activity that you'll go through as you mature your learning within automation and within RPA. The first phase we refer to as the pioneering phase. And once you're through the pioneering phase, you then move into a sustaining phase. This chapter, particularly around piloting, is focused specifically around pioneering. Pioneering to us is more than just about automation. It's about ideation, exploration, and incubation of ideas. Ideation means creating an environment that will foster innovation and new ideas, and will begin the cultural changes necessary to successfully implement your RPA program. In the early days, there's going to be some exploration, particularly about selecting the right tool for you, and also maybe testing one or two tools to see which one is the best fit. There's going to be learning of new tools and techniques to apply RPA to your program. And of course, you're going to start incubating some of those ideas. And the best way to do that is through a pilot, which allows you to start small. Although we're not specifically going to cover this in this chapter, we will come back to this later on, which is the topic of how do you move beyond the pilot and sustain your automation program. And this will cover topics such as adoption, how you can accelerate the program and scale, and how you can implement continuous improvement to continually learn and develop within the context of your automation program. Phil First, founder and chief analyst at Horses for Sources, posted this message last year, and it's a stark warning for people setting out on their automation journey. He said he had seen around a third of pilots getting botched because clients are approaching it all wrong, not looking at RPAs one process at a time, not thinking about milestones and a workable governance mechanism. Many are looking for a silver bullet that simply doesn't exist. This is software like anything else and needs a proper investment plan. I blame too many poor advisors and hyped media. It is a stark warning and actually something we should take note of. There are other messages out there anecdotally that say over half of pilots fail. Our goal is to provide the structures and frameworks to actually address the challenges that Phil lays down. providing a workable governance mechanism with a well-known approach that will provide strong but light governance necessary for an RPA program. Before we embark on our pilot, we've already established through a number of steps we need to complete in terms of engaging stakeholders and educating in terms of what automation can do. And there may be some self-analysis to complete to narrow down a selection of vendors in order to be able to select the right tool to run the pilot with. But now you're at the point of assembling the team and you need to start picking the right solution. For pilots, the low-hanging fruit is definitely the place to start. You want something that's impactful, but also achievable. Which leads us neatly to the question, why do we think pilots are the right way to go? It goes without saying, I'm a big fan of using pilots, and here are the reasons why. To begin with, a pilot allows you to start at a smaller scale and begin to learn the skills that you need. You can begin to evaluate the impact, the feasibility, and the real amount of time and costs that are going to be associated with your program. It gives you the opportunity to experiment with new ideas and try different variations. One example that we use when running pilots is potentially to run a pilot with more than one solution to evaluate which is the best fit for your particular organization. The biggest challenge that we often find with automation is not the technology, but it's the culture in which you're implementing the technology. And that's why we've been talking so much about engaging people and some of the lean principles to help you get through that program. But you've got to understand and figure out what is the right fit for your culture and your people. It is going to be unique to each organization. This is not a sheep dip exercise where you can simply get the answer from somebody else. It also gives you opportunity to obtain customer feedback. This is fantastic from a lean perspective because all value is driven by the customer. But even small scale pilots can be very rewarding in terms of the amount of information that they provide. The model on the right hand of the screen is the model that we demonstrated as part of the lean startup approach. This is an iterative approach that allows you to test new ideas, build solutions in a rapid iterative cycle. It's an approach that fits really well with demonstrating and leading a pilot for automation. A pilot is also small scale and allows you to identify some of the challenges, risks and adverse events while still at a manageable size, and allows you to take that information and predict what the impact would be when running at scale. You may have some ideas in terms of how you expect the process to work, but reality can often be different, and this gives you the chance to improve upon your initial model before you start operating at a wider, more impactful scale. So for us, piloting is a great approach because it's a small controlled environment and you don't have to consider every real world scenario and every real world sort of variation. That's something that comes in when you move beyond your pilot. For your pilot, you can narrow it down to a simple process in a specific area and keep it very controlled. One of the questions which comes up regularly when we speak at conferences is a question of how do you select your first process? There isn't a simple single answer, but some of the key factors are definitely finding a process that is going to have sufficient impact for people to take notice. We often use the calculation of time and volume. Which is your highest impact process of which you've got a lot of or takes a lot of time? These are the processes that are ideal for automation. You want a process that's indicative of your organization in terms of the systems that it uses without being the most complicated scenario you could find. It also has to be in an area that has strong sponsorship and leadership. And finally, you have to find an empowered or establish an empowered team to help you drive that forward. So in selecting your first process, there are definitely a number of criteria to help you along the way. And we've put together what we call the process funnel to help you narrow down to that process. But once your operation is up and running on a regular basis, the same funnel will help you continually prioritize in real time which are the processes that are the next best for automation. We have heard of organizations conducting multiple week assessments before deciding on which is the first process to undertake. To us, this feels like boiling the ocean. There is a way, particularly for your pilot, to narrow down to the right process to automate much more quickly. It does require some work and does require some assessment, but you don't have to assess absolutely every process and map every process in your organization to be able to do so. When talking to organizations for the first time, this is our automation funnel. How do we narrow down to the right selection of processes? And the first selection sometimes is quite simple to identify. There is an area of the business that's already been identified as a high potential area or high priority area in terms of business demand. Alternatively, we see the opposite. There are certain areas of the business going through a significant amount of existing change, which means that that area is currently off limits. So the first limiting factor is often something that you can identify within your own organization to narrow down to which areas are the most likely candidates. Having identified those candidate areas, the next step is perhaps to look at the highest time and volume. This is looking for high impact processes, and you tend to find within organizations the processes that take the longest or with the highest volume or combination of the two are the processes which tend to fit into the runner category. And runner processes are typically the ones you're looking for when we start to look to identify which is the next best process to automate. We then start to do a deeper analysis. These first few criteria allow you to narrow down to a selection of processes really quickly. Now it's time to really roll your sleeves up and to apply some additional criteria. And I'm going to come on to what that criteria is in the next slide. Having completed that assessment, your next step is simply to select based on what you've found. It may not be the item at the top of the list, for example, that you select, because the area selected may not have quite the right people available for you to be able to run that exercise right now. So this lets you choose from the highest priority items, which is the best area to actually begin that's most likely for success. And then, having selected your process, you can begin the process of automation. And this process actually works as an ongoing process. Once you begin to operationalize, it allows you to narrow down to the vital few and keep adding new processes to the top of the funnel and narrow them down to which is the next best item to automate. Another way to describe time and volume is high operational impact. These are tasks which are high volume or very labor intensive. And for some organizations, this narrows us down to a selection of processes that allows us to select a pilot process very quickly. But if it doesn't, there are more criteria you can begin to apply and start looking at the process in a bit more detail. For example, when we think about high operational impact, how much gain do we think we can get from automation? Do we think that we're going to achieve at least 25% gain? For a pilot, you want to demonstrate significant impact. And is it a part of your core operational processes? Generally speaking, if it's high volume, it will be. The second question you can start to apply to your selection of processes is to what degree those processes are rule-based versus judgment. Another way to describe these are runners versus rogues. You want processes which are at least 70% rule-based, that you can document the steps of the process using the lean techniques we've discussed in a relatively straightforward manner. In other words, they tend to be low complexity or low number of identifiable exceptions to that process. In the ideal world, they've already been standardized and you have some standardized work. The third factor to consider for those processes is the question of quality. To what degree does the process generate errors? Those errors generate failure demand, unnecessary rework that's done after the process is completed. So can we eliminate those manual errors and wasteful activities by automating the process? And of course, quality built in, that validation as part of the process. Again, making it as straight through processing as possible. Another factor we can start to consider for each of those narrowed processes is to what degree they are repeatable and scalable. For example, is there a reuse opportunity to share this process across other areas of the business or other affiliates in the business? Is it an enterprise level usage? And to what degree is there fluctuating demand and seasonal activity that means the scalability of an automated process is very helpful to organizations, eliminating the need for retaining staff for repeater type processes. Next, we have low or no touch. Is the process something that we could run end to end with no need for human interactions? And this helps us decide, particularly between the desktop and RPA type of automation, attended or unattended. And finally, not necessarily for your pilot, but certainly when this becomes an ongoing process, what is the opportunity to test new and innovative services that automation brings to your organization? Many opportunities have high manual effort and therefore are rejected. Automation may now open the door to having those services provided. So this process selection grid allows you to drill deeper on each of the processes you've narrowed down to. But you're not doing this assessment on every process in the whole organization. You're just doing this on the processes that have come to the top of the list based on your prior narrowing. Based on the information you glean from these 6 criteria will highlight which is the right process for you to use in your pilot. Now, pilots don't have to just be a single process. Pilots, depending on the size of the process, will be between 1 and 5 processes looked at. So it can depend exactly on your organization. Having identified your candidate or candidates for your process automation, you now have to start on the road of documenting what that process does. The first step on that road, and the first tool that we often get out of the tool bag, is a tool called SIPOC. SIPOC are the initials that stand for suppliers, inputs, processes, outputs, and customers. SIPOC's a fantastic tool. It's a very quick representation of the process that helps you to demonstrate what are the boundaries of the work that you're going to do. It aids an understanding of all the connections between suppliers and inputs and outputs and customers. It's a tool that you can then use to discuss with the stakeholders to ensure their understanding and make sure this is the right process to be automating. We'll look at an example of the SIPOC on the next page. But effectively, each of the 5 categories contain the following information. Suppliers provide the inputs to the process. The inputs are data, forms, resources, knowledge, etc. that are passed from the suppliers. Processes are literally the process described in 5 to 7 very high level steps. We're going to drill down into much more detail later on, but this is just to get a big picture understanding. We then have a list of what are the outputs produced, and then from a customer perspective, what are the outputs and their expectations and their requirements. Some organizations do this in reverse. The reverse of this process is called a COPIS and simply rearranges the information into a slightly different order. Now, arguably, COPIS puts the customer at the front. So you start with the customer perspective. And for this reason, some people prefer that approach. So this is an example of a SIPOC, something that you've produced to help demonstrate what is going on within one of the selected processes. As you can see across the top, we have the 5 initials SIPOC, giving us supplier, input, process, output, and customer. And then this example is a general ledger example from a month-end close. And we can see all of the people, external and internal, who provide inputs to that close process. We can also see all of the documents that are included, or electronic feeds that are included into that process. Skipping over the process steps for a second, we can also start to see what are all of the outputs generated and who are the customers of those outputs. The SIPOC from this perspective helps us identify all the people we need to include that understand both the customer and the supplier needs of this process. The process steps then are very broad brush, very high level, to give an understanding of what the process does. It helps people to understand what we're looking at without the need to drill down into the real nitty-gritty, devils in the detail data. But of course, to automate this, we're going to need that information, and we'll do that in a subsequent step. The information we collect using a SIPOC, which can be done very quickly, is very important in helping us to narrow down that selection process. It may highlight some inputs or outputs or customers that mean that this is going to be a complex process, and therefore something we can take off the list temporarily, especially when we're looking for something for the pilot. Remember, we want something that's achievable, representative, and have high impact, but we don't want something that is unnecessarily complex. Having completed the SIPOC and decided to continue with this process, the next step is to start to think about value stream mapping. We mentioned value stream mapping in the previous chapter. Remember, this was a representation of the process with all the value added and non-value added steps all currently carried out in the process to deliver what the customer wants. Its purpose is firstly to visualize the process, put it in front of the team so that they can actually see it. They can challenge it as well, and actually you can identify where some of the variation is currently sitting within the process. It gives you the opportunity to point to problems. The value stream map is a really interactive tool with lots of red pen all over as people identify opportunities as they're mapping out the process and understand what's currently happening. It gives a focus for the whole transformation. We often complete a value stream map and then put it up in the business area with other members of the team so they can see what the discussion has been and also understand what changes are going on, but also provide further insights that we may have missed in the initial pass. Value stream maps also tend to exist in 2 flavors, the current state and the future state map. So hence we use it as a communication tool to understand where we are today and where we're trying to get to. It helps us to understand the whole end-to-end or wing-to-wing process flow. It shows us all the links between different process steps. And for each process step, the facilitator is there to challenge every step and identify potential sources of waste. Alongside the development of the value stream map is a large car park of actions that are being generated, currently prioritised, but it will eventually be prioritised, which the team are identifying as they're identifying and challenging each step of the process. The value stream map is a visual tool that helps you to identify the whole process and also identify waste. So here's an example of some value stream mapping in process. What do we see in this picture? Well, first of all, this person is the facilitator. The facilitator is there to help structure the session, but predominantly there to challenge every step of the process as it's documented. As each step of the process is being challenged, lots of information gets revealed. This information is recorded in the car park. As you can see, the car park contains a lot of information. This is currently unfiltered. It has all of the ideas, but not in a structured manner yet. A later step will actually start to put some structure around the car park. But here we're recording all the potential improvements to the process and all the potential waste that can be eliminated. Here we have the team of people who are involved in the process. These people do the process currently and have been empowered to be able to make changes to that process. They provide all of the insights in terms of what the customer needs, and they have experience of understanding those customer demands. Also in this picture, we have a co-facilitator. Running a lean event can be very challenging, and having a co-facilitator as a second pair of eyes and a second pair of ears to all of the information that's being disseminated can be really helpful. Now, on the wall in front of us, we have the value stream map. Now, this is the current state map. This is the process as it is currently working and that has the team understand it. Part of the mapping process would have also included a visit to the team to actually see the work in progress, to actually help them understand what is going on and visualize the process as it works in real life. This team have used color-coded post-its, which is quite handy to help describe what's going on the value stream map. The yellow post-its are the customers and the suppliers. We tend to transpose this straight from the SIPOC. Sometimes customers and suppliers are the same. The customer provides input and receives output from a process, for example. We can start to see the inputs and outputs from the process, and sometimes those communications are wasteful communications. On other occasions, they may actually be communication steps missing, and we need to insert more communication to the customer. The orange post-its on this map are actually the value steps in the value stream. Now, they could be value adding or non-value adding. And if they're non-value adding, we quite often put a big red X through them as they go. But whatever the steps are, they're in bold terms a series of tasks that are completed in a single point in time. So there's often wait time between each of the process steps. Mapping each of the process steps and challenge them as they go generates a lot of information that is stored on the car park. That information is used to highlight how we'll build a new future state. Below each of these process steps, we often see another post-it note, this time in pink. This is generally information about that process step. It will likely be information like the amount of time it takes to complete that task, but also contains information such as inventory and volume that is important to the processing of the task. If we have data such as quality or defects that occur, then we'd also annotate that type of information alongside each task within the value stream. Between each of the big process tasks, we have a blue post-it. This is usually wait time. Wait time demonstrates how much time is passing between each of the tasks being completed. And it's amazing how often you see long wait times between simple and small steps within a process. The team have literally just reached the point where they've mapped the current state and they've documented all of their ideas within the car park. The facilitator has now put up a new blank sheet of brown paper and is going to start building a new future state. That future state is an incremental improvement to the current situation. So quite often they have a clearly defined time frame, generally somewhere in the vicinity of 12 weeks, a 3-month set of objectives to improve the process to a new stable state. As the new future state is being created, an action plan constructed of all of the ideas that were previously generated when they evaluated the current state is starting to be built. For small processes, a value stream mapping exercise can be done in a day. For larger processes, they can take multiple days, or even be split over multiple teams and reassembled if the process is particularly complex. Here's what we just described in a little bit of a clearer format. So when we do value stream mapping, these are the steps that we go through. The first step, the yellow post-its, was to identify customer, supplier, and any external sources for the process. The second step is to understand the current process flow. So we describe the high-level process steps and understand and draw the flow of information between suppliers, us, and sources and the customers. For each step that we put up, we identify the high-level timings. And we identify inventory levels, the number of cases that are currently sitting at that stage. And we also challenge the process to understand value-added versus non-value-added steps within the process. Generally, there are lots of ideas in terms of how that step in the process could be improved. And those ideas and challenges are all documented on the car park. The car park is initially a stream of consciousness of value-adding and non-value-adding tasks that are going on within the process, but also many ideas for improvements, which will all come into play when we start to develop the future state. Here's another example of a value stream map. The red flashes that you see are all of the improvement opportunities. You can also see on this process where actually steps of the process have been crossed out and eliminated completely from the process. The pulse that runs underneath the process steps, which look a little bit like battlements, contain both the touch time, i.e. the time it takes for the process action to be completed, and the wait time, the time between those process steps. The sum of both the processing time and the wait time is the overall cycle time, the total time the customer will tend to see for the completion of that process. Now, take a good look, as this is an example of a current state as a first cycle set of improvements for a process that we looked at. The next slide is going to contain the future state for the same process. Radically different, yes? And this is why we believe that process improvement and value stream mapping and lean thinking will significantly improve your automation program, because you'll be optimizing processes and automating the optimized version. Imagine how much time it would have taken you to have automated all of the variations and challenges and unnecessary steps that we would have seen in the previous slide. Lift and drop will bring all of your historical baggage into the automation. The argument that it takes too much time to complete these activities for processes and just want to get on with the automation is a bit of a fallacy. automating a very complex process would take a lot longer than automating a simplified process. It also provides you with all the documentation necessary for ongoing maintenance. So, it mitigates one of the key risks, which is the loss of information. For many processes, lean events, such as the one that we've sort of just seen in the picture and the outputs produced, can be generated in just a few days. It's time well spent as part of your pilot and part of your ongoing process. So for completeness, here are the steps you go through when documenting your future state. The first step is to agree the time horizon for your future state. Now, this can be any time horizon, but a typical example is around about 12 weeks or 3 months. There are many widely different views in terms of how long you should spend on documenting and piloting your first automation processes, but a 12-week cycle is not a bad time frame. It allows you to do changes and iterations within that time and actually start to gain some real sort of data back to evaluate the success and improvement opportunities within your process. It's a cyclical process as well. Your pilot is there to prove a few key points, not to solve every problem. Now, quite often, most of the improvements were identified as Kazon burst, or those red flashes upon the original current state map. But now the challenge is to start building the new value stream map for your future state. This future state considers all of the things we've considered so far, all of those lean principles, all of those foundations, and all of those opportunities. That means in removing non-value added steps from the process. It means, how do we organize ourselves? How does the process flow? How do we level the process and sequence the process? What's the impact on people? How do we put in place just in time? And how do we standardize? And of course, what are the opportunities for automation? Finally, we go back to the car park to cross off all of the items that we've used to identify if there are any further improvement opportunities which we will add to our action plan to develop the new future state. That action plan becomes our goal for all of the iterations of improvements as we move forward, developing the new process and the automation alongside. Value stream mapping looks at the whole process and lets you document things end to end. Sometimes you inevitably run down to quite a low level of detail as you go through a value stream mapping exercise, but that's not necessarily its main purpose. So the next level of detail down is process mapping. Process looks at things on a task by task basis and usually identifies some further opportunities for improvement. The objective of process mapping is now to identify all the steps or tasks that you go through so that everybody has a common understanding. It helps you to document the steps that you're going to need when you write your automation. The first stage of process mapping is to document or brainstorm down each of the process steps. You can consolidate and refine those process steps as you have the discussion. Normally you start placing them in roughly the correct sequence and you break them down into actions and decisions. Attach an arrow between each of the steps to indicate serial and parallel paths. Process maps are starting now to give you the detail of the specific tasks you need to create within the workflow. Here's an example of a process map. This is a specific type of process map called a deployment chart. A deployment chart differs only in that it provides rows across the screen to define different teams or different groups who perform different parts of the task. Here, the process map has got square boxes indicating that something's being done. It's a process or a task being carried out. Or diamond boxes, which is a decision point where a decision is made and the process differs depending on the outcome of that decision. Many of the automation tools have workflow options within them to literally map out the process in exactly the way that you see in a deployment chart here. By the time you've documented your process to this level of detail, you've got almost everything you need to begin to start developing your automation. Typically, the only information that you're missing are the specific fields from the screens where data is coming from, and you can easily annotate that into some of the documentation you produce while you're doing your lean activities in order to provide that information and have it available when you need it later on. You may recall from the Toyota house in the foundations was a component called stability or standard work, and you've now produced almost all the components you need for standard work. Standard work or stability provides you with a baseline of your process that you know everybody is going to follow. It has eliminated all of the wasteful tasks, and by doing so, it's mitigated the risk of having to recode your model for relatively small changes in the process later on. It probably goes a little without saying, but the benefits of standard work are simply to know the best sequences and the times for each operation. To be able to perform to these standards continuously, knowing that you are doing the work correctly. To be able to perform to established standards and balance the workforce to customer demand. It sets the baseline for future improvement, that striving for perfection. And it simplifies the training on the job. It gives the information to everybody new who's coming in. It sustains a consistent quality and level of productivity. However, without team buy-in and consensus, improvements will not be sustained. We're back to culture again, a key component of what we're doing. So standard work gives us all of the information we need for a process, whether it's going to be performed by a human or whether it's going to be performed by a bot. A few things to remember though about standard work are it's never intended to be static. If a better way is found, then the procedure is updated. Standard work reduces variation because the work is performed the same way each time, and this is effectively always true when we're doing this with the bot. Moreover, variations to that process are now much easier to recognize. So if we do need to implement automation and stop a defect, it's very easy for us to identify those situations. Standard work is really essential for continuous improvement as we move from one standard to the next without ever slipping back. One final element that we consider when we do standard work is to consider operator or robot balancing. This is to make sure that each person is effectively fully utilized. We typically do this for people by working out the takt time, i.e. how many items do we have to produce over a certain period. And then we work out how long it takes to complete a piece of work, in this case a work sequence ABCD. In this example, it takes 4 and a little bit of people to be able to complete one item worth of time. But the way the process exists currently is shown on the first chart, where we see people underutilized for periods of time. What we want to do is optimize the process so all of our people are fully occupied. That leaves us some spare time for one person in which we would insert a different task. This same principle of operator balancing is what we need to do when we consider the automation, and we'll do exactly the same tasks when looking at our robots as we would have done for our people. So for the processes that we're looking at, we will have documented the value stream, the deployment chart. We have documented any standard working practices in terms of which systems are used and what data is entered where. And we will have calculated an operator balance chart to understand how we meet demand. As part of your pilot, you're going to want to put in place a number of measurements. If we imagine for a minute that that you're just dealing with a human workforce, then your typical measurements you would see are performance, productivity, efficiency, and accuracy. But what additional measures do you need to start to consider as you start to implement automation? Well, assisted automation, for example, you might start to add in measures of speed or improvement in accuracy. There are also a number of real-time measurements we've talked about when we think about lean processing that moves us away from SLAs and more into what is the throughput. RPA starts to add additional measures of performance and load. What's the response time and what's the level of utilization of those bots? Finally, when you get to machine learning, what's the level of recognition that you're starting to see? These are all new measures that you'll need to establish alongside your pilots and then ongoing work. Other measurements you want to consider are for the program as a whole. So types of measures that you so often see are FTE type measures. For example, the number of FTE reduced, or at least the FTE capacity that's being created. Often financial becomes an important factor, so the payback period or the return on investment are two other measurements that are applied to the program as a whole rather than individual process activities. So with measurements still in mind, what are the key measurements of your program and how will you collect that information? Pause the video now and just take 5 minutes to think about the key measures for your own program. Welcome back. How did you get on? If you'd like to share some of the information, then please join us on the RPA Academy forum to discuss whatever you found. This is the RPA game plan we looked at in an earlier chapter. The game plan gives us the bold steps we need to undertake to implement the program as a whole. The items we've bolded on this are the steps that we've gone through as we've run through our pilot, and you can see that we haven't necessarily looked at all of the factors. And that's perfectly fine. A pilot, as you remember, is a limited focus. It's on a specific area or a specific product in order for you to test and learn as you go through the steps of developing a new automation. But having completed the automation, you've now got your results. It's now time to evaluate those results and understand how that feeds into your overall game plan and understand what you need to do to be able to scale up. So you did a good job of raising awareness within the area that you conducted the pilot, but you're still going to have to now grow that to a scale beyond the pilot and into other areas of the organization. Instead of just identifying your initial process, you've now got to create an ongoing process for identifying opportunities for automation. And that's now going to come not from one area, but from multiple areas. So being able to nominate a champion, for example, who can work with each area to help you identify those initial opportunities is going to be important. The backlog prioritization is now an ongoing task of being able to assess the complexity of all of those new processes that are coming through. And it now also becomes a task to identify commonality that you can reuse across multiple areas of the organization. From an operating model perspective, the focus has been on the team, i.e. empowerment, or on the technology, making sure we choose the right technology. But now it becomes about the right operating model and the organizational structure to support the new operating model. The development was quite simple. We'd only developed between 1 and 5 processes. So we pretty much went through the lean process, optimized it, and developed, tested, and delivered it. Now it gets more complicated. To be able to do this on a repeatable scale, we now need to think about how we can continually optimize for robotic process automation, how we can standardize the process of development and test, and how we manage the ongoing process of new service introduction. And throughout all of this, we need to put in place a retrospective, an ability to evaluate how well it's going and make corrections to our course as we learn more. From an ongoing maintenance and improvement perspective, during the pilot, all we did was deploy. But this is perhaps the most complex area for us to establish, because we now need to establish ongoing performance monitoring, optimizing the robot, and being able to adapt and change as regulation changes, for example, to be able to update robots en masse. We need to put in place a support model, what happens when things fail. And we also need to put in that continuous improvement model, understanding how we ongoing improve the processes we've established. And we need to engage more and more champions across the business to be able to support the program. So the game plan gave us a vision for the program overall, and we've been picking off pieces of it as we've gone through the pilot. And one of the key things about the pilot, if there's any areas on there that we're not sure about, then the idea is to test them during the pilot so that we can get our answers and refine it at this stage. So we've come to an end of this chapter. Now's a good time to do another recap and just see what it is that we've learned. Do you remember our automation delivery lifecycle? We're going to revisit it now and look at what we've learned to actually apply it to this timeline. And of course, it's no surprise, everything we've looked at in the last chapter has been focused specifically around the getting started phase. So what have we done? We've looked at the difference between pioneering and sustaining. And the difference is when you're pioneering and selecting your first pilot to narrow down your focus, but also drive creativity and ideation and collaboration as a key part of that team. We've looked at the funnel for selecting your first process, and then the more detailed assessment for selecting which process is the one that you want to pilot, or processes. We've looked at lean in detail and lean process design and things like the 7 types of waste to help us eliminate waste from our processes and optimize them for automation. We've looked at quite a number of tools this time. So we started with the SIPOC to actually give us a high-level view of the process. We also looked at value stream mapping as a way to look at the process end to end and get the big picture view of what we can do to improve. And we've looked at deployment charts or process maps to give us the level of detail that we need to then translate into an automation. So we've seen the Toyota house in detail and the lean principles, the 7+1 types of waste, and we've seen multiple tools, the SIPOC, the value stream mapping, the process map, operator balancing, and the importance for standard work. From an automation perspective, we've looked at pioneering and piloting automation. We've looked at how we select the first process, and we've looked at some of the considerations for measurement. Revisiting our goals for the program overall, we've also seen how we prepare and execute a pilot and how you go about selecting your first process. And we've talked more about engaging stakeholders and communicating automation. So in one final slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we've discussed. We've talked a lot today about getting started, and that means piloting. And that means taking on a bit of a pioneering spirit to move forward and drive forward your innovation program. In terms of the methodology then, we've considered the overall game plan, the bold steps and the vision for what it is you're trying to achieve. And we've looked at the different approaches and pretty much landed on both lean and lean startup use the same principle of iterative development. Testing and learning as you go. Lean thinking continually iterates through understanding the customer value, mapping their value stream, establishing flow, implementing pull, and continually striving for perfection. That striving for perfection is key to multiple iterations. But also, it's about dealing with the customer and measuring and gaining feedback with each new build that you put in place. The key tools then to help us drive this are SIPOC to give us a high level view, value stream mapping challenged using the lean techniques to optimize, and then actually process view to be able to document the process in the detail that you need to automate. And that's our goal, to be able to have all the information that you need at hand to efficiently build your automations and have them in a documented and high quality way. It's been a lot to take in this chapter, so I hope you found that useful. As always, my contact details will be on the next page, so please feel free to contact me with any feedback or comments on the training. Or feel free to share your comments and thoughts on the RPA Academy website on the forum social section. Thank you again for listening.